When European explorers first encountered the Kingdom of Benin in the late 15th century, they didn't find what they expected. They didn't discover primitive settlements or disorganized villages scattered through the forest. What they found instead was something that challenged everything they thought they knew about Africa. A sophisticated metropolis with wide, straight streets stretching as far as the eye could see. Massive earthwork fortifications that dwarfed anything in Europe. A complex political system governed by divine kingship, and artistic traditions producing works so magnificent that European museum curators would later compare them to the masterpieces of the Italian Renaissance. The Portuguese captain Lourenço Pinto, visiting in 1691, observed that Benin City was larger than Lisbon itself, and so well governed that theft was virtually unknown. Dutch writer Olfert Dapper, compiling accounts from merchants who had visited the kingdom, described a city at least 4 miles wide with organized streets, large houses with clay walls, and a level of urban planning that seemed almost incomprehensible to European observers at the time. This wasn't supposed to exist in Africa, at least not according to the narratives that Europeans were constructing about the continent. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we get into this, I want to acknowledge something important up front. What we're going to explore today is the history of the Kingdom of Benin, located in what is now southern Nigeria, a kingdom with no historical relation whatsoever to the modern Republic of Benin, which was known as Dahomey until 1975. This confusion of names has led to a lot of misunderstanding, so let's be clear from the start. We're talking about the Edo-speaking kingdom centered in Benin City, in present-day Edo State, Nigeria. This is a kingdom that flourished from around the 11th century until its violent destruction by British forces in 1897. It's also worth noting that much of Benin's history comes to us through oral tradition, which means that scholars sometimes offer different accounts of when and how certain developments occurred. We're going to navigate these debates as best we can, acknowledging uncertainty where it exists, while painting as complete a picture as possible of this remarkable civilization. So here's what we're examining today. The Kingdom of Benin represents one of the most sophisticated examples of state formation, urban planning, and artistic achievement in pre-colonial West Africa. For centuries, this kingdom developed complex systems of governance, created architectural marvels that rank among the largest earthworks ever constructed by human hands, maintained extensive trade networks that eventually connected them to Europe, and produced artistic works so technically advanced that they shattered European assumptions about African capabilities. Yet this history has been systematically marginalized, overlooked, and in some cases actively suppressed in mainstream historical discourse. The very artifacts that could tell this story, the famous Benin Bronzes, were looted during a colonial invasion and scattered across museums in Europe and North America, separated from the people whose ancestors created them. What we're going to do is reconstruct this history, understand what made Benin exceptional, examine how Europeans actually responded when confronted with African achievement, and trace how colonialism violently disrupted one of Africa's longest-lasting kingdoms. This isn't just ancient history. The questions it raises about cultural heritage, colonial violence, and whose stories get told remain urgently relevant today. Let's begin with the foundations. The origins of the Kingdom of Benin are wrapped in mythology and oral tradition. According to tradition, the region was first ruled by a dynasty of semi-mythical kings called the Ogisos, literally kings of the sky, who governed what was then known as Igodomigodo and established craft guilds for carpenters, sculptors, and weavers. Around the 13th century, the Edo people invited Prince Oranmiyan from the neighboring kingdom of Ife to rule them. His son, Eweka, is regarded as the first Oba, the title for Benin's kings. This connection to Ife is significant because it brought bronze casting expertise to Benin, either through imported craftsmen or mutual exchange of techniques. By the 13th century, Benin had begun creating the metal sculptures that would eventually become world-famous. Royal power truly consolidated under the Oba Ewedo in the late 13th century, but the kingdom's transformation into a major regional power came under Oba Ewar the Great, who ruled around 1440 to 1480. Iware is remembered as both a great warrior and a magician, a ruler who fundamentally reshaped Benin's political and physical landscape. He established hereditary succession to the throne, ending the chaotic power struggles that had plagued earlier periods. He vastly expanded the kingdom's territory, which by the mid-16th century extended from the Niger River Delta in the east to what is now Lagos in the west. Perhaps most importantly for our story, Ewuare rebuilt the capital city, endowing it with the great walls and moats that would become one of the kingdom's most distinctive features. And those walls, let me tell you about these walls, because they represent an engineering achievement that fundamentally challenges the narrative of African technological backwardness. The walls of Benin, known as Iya in the Edo language, constitute what the 1974 edition of the Guinness Book of Records called the world's largest earthworks carried out prior to the mechanical era. We're talking about a network of earthworks that, at its peak, spanned approximately 16,000 kilometers of ramparts and moats. To put that in perspective, that's 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China. Archaeologists estimate that these earthworks consumed 100 times more material than the Great Pyramid of Cheops. One estimate suggests they required 150 million hours of labor to construct. This wasn't built in a single burst of activity. Construction began as early as 800 AD and continued until around 1460. This represents a multi-generational project reflecting what scholars have called the collective will of a people, with each generation building on the work of those who came before. The walls consisted of a sophisticated system of moats and ramparts. The construction method was ingenious. Workers would dig deep ditches to form the inner moats, then use the excavated earth to build the outer ramparts, creating what engineers call a dump rampart. The innermost walls surrounding Benin City were the tallest and most impressive, reaching heights of up to 20 meters, that's about 66 feet, in some sections. These weren't just random barriers scattered across the landscape. The system was carefully planned, with the walls forming concentric rings around Benin City and extending outward to encompass hundreds of villages and settlements. The entire complex covered approximately 6,500 square kilometers and was broken by 9 manned gates that controlled access to the capital. The defensive purpose of these walls is obvious, but they served symbolic functions as well. They represented the power and organizational capacity of the kingdom, the ability of the Oba to mobilize labor on a massive scale, and the clear demarcation between the sacred space of the royal capital and the surrounding territory. When Dutch explorer Dirk Ruiters visited in the early 1600s, he specifically noted the fortifications, describing the earthworks, moats, and well-guarded gates. Olfert Dapper, writing in 1668 from the accounts of Dutch travelers, went so far as to claim the walls were 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China, a comparison that, as it turns out, was pretty accurate. Now, inside those walls, the city itself was a marvel of urban planning. Benin City at its height was home to somewhere between 80,000 to 100,000 people, compared to London's population of only about 50,000 in 1500. The city was organized according to what modern researchers have identified as fractal design, a form of mathematical planning where smaller units replicate the pattern of larger ones. The city was divided into 11 divisions, each one essentially a miniature version of the Oba's court at the center. These divisions contained multiple compounds with houses, workshops, and public buildings, all organized along straight, wide streets that contemporary European visitors consistently remarked upon. Portuguese ship captain Lourenço Pinto, writing in 1691, provides one of the most detailed European accounts. He observed that Benin City was larger than Lisbon, wealthy, industrious, and so well governed that theft was virtually unknown. The level of security, he noted, was such that people didn't even put doors on their houses. Think about what that says about the kingdom's social organization and legal system. This wasn't just impressive architecture, it was a functioning society with sophisticated mechanisms for maintaining order and resolving disputes. Benin was also one of the first cities in the world to have something resembling street lighting. High metal lamps placed throughout the city held wicks fueled by palm oil, providing illumination at night. When you read European accounts from this same period describing London or other European cities, places plagued by crime, unsanitary conditions, and chaotic street layouts, the contrast becomes striking. The artistic achievement of Benin is where we see perhaps the clearest evidence of the kingdom's sophistication. The Benin Bronzes, actually made primarily of brass and bronze, represent one of the most important artistic traditions anywhere in the world. These works served specific functions in the ritual and political life of the kingdom, embodying its history and power in physical form. The tradition flourished particularly during the Golden Ages under Oba Esigi, 1504–1550, and Oba Erasoyan, 1735–1750. The artists used the lost wax technique with incredible precision. They would create a detailed wax model over a clay core, apply fine clay to invest it, then add coarser clay to form a mold. After heating to melt away the wax, molten metal was poured into the void. The remarkable thing is that Benin artists achieved such refinement in their original modeling that they didn't need to chase details into the bronze after casting. The texture of luxury cloth, fine rope braids, intricate bells, all of this was formed first in wax with precision that transferred perfectly to metal. The most well-known works are the rectangular brass plaques that once decorated the walls and pillars of the Oba's palace. More than 850 relief plaques, each one a historical document. They depict scenes from the kingdom's history: battles, court ceremonies, religious rituals, encounters with European traders. They show the Oba surrounded by attendants, warriors in full regalia, symbolic animals like the mudfish and crocodile that carried deep cultural meaning. These weren't random decorative choices. Each element had significance within Edo cosmology and political symbolism. The leopard, for instance, appears constantly in Benin art, representing the Oba's power and dominance. Only the king and high-ranking officials were permitted to wear or display leopard imagery. When war chiefs earned leopard decorations, the Oba would bestow hip ornaments in the form of leopard heads as both protection and a mark of honor. Beyond the plaques, Benin artists produced commemorative heads cast in bronze to honor past Obas and queen mothers, placing them on ancestral altars where they played crucial roles in ceremonies validating the succession of new rulers. They created elaborate altarpieces, ceremonial staffs, and royal regalia, carved ivory into ornate masks, boxes, combs, and armlets. The famous ivory hip masks, possibly depicting Idia, the mother of Oba Esigi and the first queen mother, represent some of the finest ivory carving anywhere in the world. When these works reached Europe, German curator Felix von Luschan, trying to explain Benin art to a European audience more familiar with Renaissance sculpture, famously stated that Benvenuto Cellini, one of the great metalworkers of the Italian Renaissance, could not have made a better cast himself. These bronzes, von Luschan argued, stood at the summit of what could be technically achieved in metal casting. This wasn't some patronizing acknowledgement of primitive art. This was genuine recognition that African artists had mastered techniques that equaled or exceeded anything being done in Europe at the same time. Now, let's talk about Benin's engagement with Europe, because this is where the story gets complicated. The Portuguese made first contact around 1472, during the reign of Oba Ozulua, who was nicknamed the Conqueror for his military campaigns. Unlike many African kingdoms whose interactions with Europeans were limited to coastal trading posts, Benin developed actual diplomatic relations with Portugal. In the early 16th century, Oba Esigi sent an ambassador to Lisbon, and the Portuguese king reciprocated by sending Christian missionaries to Benin City. Esigi even established a school in Benin for teaching the reading and writing of Portuguese. Some residents of Benin City could still speak a pidgin Portuguese in the late 19th century, over 3 centuries after these initial contacts. The relationship was complex. The Portuguese introduced manillas, bracelet-shaped brass or copper ingots, which became a standard currency in trade. Benin had monopoly control over elephant tusks, and European traders provided access to new metals and weapons. Research has shown that these imported manillas were melted down and used by Benin artists to create many of the bronze works we're discussing. Some of the brass plaques specifically depict Portuguese merchants, showing them with their distinctive clothing and weapons, commemorating these early exchanges. Benin artists even created works specifically for the European market. Ivory salt cellars with European horse riders, brass soldiers bearing muskets, all executed with what scholars describe as a uniquely African twist. But here's what's crucial to understand. Trade with Europeans was important to Benin, but it was supplemental to the kingdom's economy, not foundational. Benin's wealth came primarily from its extensive internal trade network, from agriculture, from the control of resources like palm oil and pepper. European trade in ivory, cloth, and later in slaves provided additional revenue, but Benin wasn't dependent on Europeans the way some coastal kingdoms became. The Obas maintained control over trade, requiring that transactions go through royal monopolies. This independence would become a source of increasing tension with European powers, particularly Britain, which by the 19th century was developing an imperial mindset that couldn't tolerate African kingdoms operating as equal trading partners rather than subordinate colonies. It's important to address the slave trade because it's part of Benin's history. From the 16th through 18th centuries, Benin participated in the Atlantic slave trade, though the extent is debated. Oba Esigi outlawed selling male slaves early on, but this prohibition weakened over time. By the 18th century, after Benin came under tributary relationship with the Oyo Kingdom, exporting war captives became more significant. This doesn't make Benin unique. European powers created demand for enslaved people, and many African states participated in supplying it. The kingdom reached its territorial peak in the 16th century. At its height, Benin dominated trade along the coastline from the western Niger Delta to almost Accra in the west, ruling over numerous ethnic groups. But the 18th and early 19th centuries saw the kingdom weakened by violent succession struggles and civil wars. European suppression of the slave trade disrupted economic patterns, while Britain sought direct access to new trade goods like palm oil without African intermediaries. This brings us to the events of 1897 that destroyed the kingdom. By the late 19th century, European powers were racing to carve up Africa into colonies. In 1892, British official Captain Henry Galway got Oba Ovonramwen to sign a treaty supposedly allowing free trade through Benin's territories. The circumstances are disputed. It's unclear how much Ovonramwen understood the implications. Regardless, he continued charging customs duties, which the British saw as treaty violation. British merchants wanted the Oba removed and direct access to Benin's resources. In November 1896, Acting Consul General James Robert Phillips decided to visit Benin City to confront the Oba. Without waiting for London's approval, he set out in late December with 9 British officials and about 200 African porters. Phillips's delegation arrived during the Egg Festival, a sacred time when the Oba couldn't meet foreigners. Ovon Ramwen sent multiple messages asking Phillips to postpone. Phillips refused. As the British party approached Benin City, they were ambushed at the Ugbine village on January 4, 1897. All but 2 British officials were killed, along with many African carriers. Most accounts suggest some of the Oba's military chiefs, acting against Ovon Ramwen's wishes, ordered the ambush. The truth of who initiated the violence remains debated. Britain's response was swift and overwhelming. When news of what the British press called the Benin Massacre reached London, there was immediate outcry. British officials declared that white men cannot be killed with impunity. On January 12, 1897, Rear Admiral Harry Rawson was appointed to lead what was termed the Benin Punitive Expedition, the very name revealing its purpose. This wasn't a rescue mission or a police action, this was punishment. On February 9, 1897, the invasion began. A British force of approximately 1,200 Royal Marine sailors and Niger Coast Protectorate soldiers, organized into 3 columns and supported by warships and gunboats, advanced on Benin City. For 10 days, they fought their way through Benin's defenses. Every town and village they encountered was destroyed. British forces used artillery, bombs, and rockets, superior firepower against defenders who had muskets and traditional weapons. They didn't just target military installations. They killed civilians, including women, the elderly, and children. On February 18, 1897, they reached Benin City. What they did next was systematic cultural annihilation. The city was burned to the ground. The great walls that had stood for centuries were deliberately destroyed. The royal palace, which had housed the greatest concentration of artistic works anywhere in West Africa, was looted. British soldiers took approximately 10,000 objects: the brass and bronze sculptures, carved ivory works, wooden artifacts, ceremonial regalia, and even human remains, including skulls and teeth. Some soldiers kept items as personal trophies. Many works were sent back to Britain to be auctioned off in London to defray the cost of the military expedition. Think about that. Britain invaded a sovereign kingdom, destroyed its capital, stole its cultural heritage, and then sold that stolen property to pay for the invasion. Oba Ovon Ramwen initially escaped, but returned to surrender on August 5, 1897, arriving richly dressed with an entourage of 700 to 800 people, maintaining his dignity in defeat. The British chose exile over execution. Ovon Ramwen was sent to Calabar, where he died in January 1914, never returning to his kingdom. The looted artifacts were scattered worldwide. The British Museum acquired over 900 objects. The Berlin Ethnological Museum obtained a massive collection. Museums in the United States, Austria, and other countries acquired pieces. Private collectors bought works that passed into various collections. Today, these objects are displayed in museums worldwide, separated from the cultural context that gave them meaning. The impact on Benin was catastrophic. This wasn't just political conquest. It was cultural devastation. In the Edo language, the verb for to remember literally translates as to cast a motif in bronze. Memory was preserved in metal. Art was how history was transmitted. When the British looted the palace and destroyed the city, they weren't just taking pretty objects. They were ripping out the physical embodiments of Benin's history. As Prince Gregory Akenzwa has said, the artwork represented the history of the Benin people for centuries. Taking it was like ripping pages out of their history. The British incorporated Benin into what became colonial Nigeria, but they didn't completely abolish the monarchy. In 1914, the same year Ovonramwen died in exile, his son returned to Benin City and was crowned Oba Eweka II. The British had shifted toward a policy of indirect rule by this point, allowing traditional rulers to maintain ceremonial authority under colonial supervision. Eweka II rebuilt the royal palace, which had been destroyed in 1897. He and his successor, Oba Akenzua II, who was enthroned in 1933, strategically used art to reinvent and maintain the kingdom's identity. They commissioned new works to replace what had been stolen and reinstated royal rituals, adapting them to the colonial and later post-colonial context. Today, the Kingdom of Benin continues to exist as a traditional monarchy within the Federal Republic of Nigeria. The current Oba, Iware Dusenu, reigns in Benin City, which is now the capital of Edo State. The role is ceremonial and cultural rather than political, but it remains deeply important to the Edo people. Many of the rituals and ceremonies of the historic kingdom continue to be performed. The Guild of Bronze Casters still exists on Igun Street in Benin City, passing down their craft through generations, though they work now with the knowledge that the greatest examples of their ancestors' work are scattered across foreign museums. And this brings us to the question of repatriation. Should the Benin Bronzes be returned to Nigeria? Museums have resisted for over a century with various arguments that they're universal museums, that objects are better cared for in European institutions, that returning them would set a dangerous precedent. But these arguments ring hollow when confronted with how these objects were acquired. The conversation has shifted dramatically in recent years. In 2007, the Benin Dialogue Group was formed. Progress was slow until the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 intensified pressure on Western institutions. Germany agreed in 2021 to return Benin Bronzes. The Smithsonian committed to repatriation. The University of Aberdeen completed the first full repatriation in October 2021. Jesus College, Cambridge, returned a sculpture. The British Museum has agreed to lend some pieces, but hasn't committed to full repatriation. Nigeria's current policy is that all repatriated Benin Bronzes should go to Oba Eware II, the current Oba, as the direct descendant of the rulers who commissioned them. This has sparked debates about ultimate control: the monarchy, the Nigerian government, or shared arrangement. But that's a conversation for Nigerians to have. What makes the story of Benin so significant is what its history reveals about the narratives we've been told about Africa. Portuguese explorers in the late 15th century found a city that rivaled European capitals. Dutch merchants in the 17th century described sophisticated urban planning. European curators examining Benin Bronzes had to acknowledge technical mastery equaling Renaissance metalwork. Yet the dominant narrative about Africa remained one of backwardness. How was this maintained? Through selective attention, highlighting aspects that fit European prejudices while downplaying contradictory evidence. Through physical separation, when you encounter a Benin bronze in the British Museum labeled as an exotic artifact, it's easy to miss that it came from a sophisticated urban civilization. The walls of Benin were 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China. Why isn't that taught in world history classes? Why don't we hear about Benin City's population exceeding London's in 1500? The answer is that these facts don't fit the narrative of African inferiority that was necessary to justify colonialism, and that continues to shape how African history is marginalized. Ron Eglash has pointed out that when Europeans encountered African architecture, they considered it disorganized and primitive. It never occurred to them that Africans might have been using fractal geometry, which wouldn't be formalized in Western mathematics until the 20th century. This is the epistemological problem. African societies are judged against European standards, and when they don't conform to European patterns, they're dismissed as backward rather than recognized as representing different but equally sophisticated approaches. The destruction of Benin in 1897 wasn't just military conquest, it was an attempt to erase evidence of African achievement. The British did this precisely because Benin's existence as a sophisticated kingdom contradicted the justifications for colonial rule. The solution was to destroy the evidence or control it by putting it in museums where it could be recontextualized as primitive art. All in all, the Kingdom of Benin stands as one of the most important case studies we have for understanding both African achievement and colonial violence. Here was a kingdom that built some of the world's largest earthworks, that developed sophisticated urban planning using mathematical principles Europeans wouldn't formalize for centuries, that created art of such brilliance that it forced European curators to acknowledge African mastery, that maintained independence for hundreds of years. And here was a colonial power that responded with overwhelming force, systematic cultural destruction, and theft of an entire artistic heritage. The questions this history raises are still with us. Who gets to tell the story of African civilizations? Who controls the physical evidence? When will looted artifacts be returned? How do we build educational systems that teach the full scope of human civilizations rather than centering European experiences while marginalizing everything else? These questions shape how we understand human history and how different peoples are valued in the contemporary world. The Kingdom of Benin isn't just a story from the past. It's a living history that continues to shape contemporary debates about art, repatriation, colonialism, and whose stories matter. The artworks that British soldiers looted in 1897 are still in museums in London, Berlin, Boston, and dozens of other cities. The descendants of the artists who created those works still live in Benin City, still practice the crafts their ancestors developed, still maintain the monarchy and traditions of the kingdom, albeit in radically changed circumstances. The walls that once encircled the city still exist in fragments, though they face ongoing threats from urban development and lack of preservation resources. The history is still being written, and the questions of how we remember this kingdom and what we do about its stolen heritage remain urgently unresolved. So, I want to hear from you all. What aspects of Benin's history stood out to you? How do you think museums should handle artifacts that were looted during colonial invasions? What does it mean to preserve cultural heritage when that heritage has been forcibly separated from the culture that created it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This is the kind of conversation where we all learn from each other, where different perspectives help us understand these complex issues more fully. I appreciate you all taking the time to engage with this history, to sit with the complexity of it, to think about what it means not just for the past, but for how we build a more just relationship with African history and cultural heritage going forward. All in all, the Kingdom of Benin reminds us that African civilizations achieved remarkable things long before European contact, that African peoples developed sophisticated systems of governance, architecture, and art that deserve to be understood on their own terms rather than measured against European standards, and that the violence of colonialism wasn't just political, but cultural, targeting the very evidence of African achievement. Remembering this history, telling these stories, demanding the return of stolen heritage, these acts of memory and justice matter. They matter for understanding the past accurately, and they matter for building a future where all human civilizations are recognized and valued. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you found this valuable, consider supporting the channel. And as always, I'll see you all in the next one.